Mr. Pachauri, ladies and gentlemen, I start with a huge disadvantage because I really haven't attended any of the sessions. I'd explained to Patchy that time would not actually permit me to do so, but he said this will give a completely fresh objectivity to whatever remarks I have to make. So he did say that he was going to allow some questions, and I sort of suggested, well, why don't we just have a lot of questions, and then I can try to address my remarks towards those. But he said that would not be an appropriate way of having a valedictory address. So let me say a few things, and if there's time and interest, I'd be very happy to answer questions. First of all, I'd like to congratulate TERI for actually organizing this summit, and I think in many ways making the general public aware of the importance of sustainability. You know, practical men like to think that the only important thing is what are you proposing and what are you doing? And that, of course, in one sense is true. But, you know, when what is required is a mindset change, and particularly in a very noisy and participative culture, most of all, a very noisy and participative democracy, whoever contributes to establishing a mindset change is actually making a very big contribution. So to Patchy and his colleagues and TERI and all the others who have probably worked very hard to get the Sustainable Development Summit idea firmly inscribed on the agenda of New Delhi's events, I think it would be entirely right to offer sincere congratulations. Let me now step back a little, and you know, the ideal address is something that's actually controversial. I mean, one of the problems in life is that there's an innumerable number of statements which have all the aura of wisdom and with which nobody will disagree. They're actually not very interesting. So I think the only interesting statements are the ones that people say that's relevant, but either I agree or I don't agree. I mean, if you say something that's irrelevant, then that's really wasting people's time. So this summit is focusing on energy, water, and food security. Each of these are very important, so I will just make a few very broad remarks. You know, first, if food security, by the way, is very important, but the essence of the whole concept of sustainability is how are you handling things in the light of the difficulty of dealing with scarce resources. So in my view, energy and water are scarce resources. If we can handle the energy and water problem, food security is not a problem. Food security is a problem in making sure that everybody in the society who may not have the income to buy the food is somehow enabled to do that. And there are different ways of doing that. I mean, the government can get the food and give it to them cheap. Others would say we should just give them income transfers. There's a huge debate on that, and I won't get into it. Globally, the interesting point that I'm making is that I don't believe that food security is a problem in the same way that water and energy are problems. For the simple reason that there's enough scope for productivity enhancement in the scarce resource of land, providing water is sensibly managed. God has given enough sunlight to most people. So my first proposition is that I personally don't spend too much time, from a sustainability point of view, worrying about food security. One should worry about food security from the distributional point of view. Is everyone getting a fair amount of food? But the additional food needed, I'm now talking about India, the additional food needed for those who really need it is well within the capacity of Indian agriculture to produce. It may well be that you have to pay a higher price for it, but that's not a food security problem. That's actually ultimately an income problem. So that's point number one. Point number two is that energy and water security are really serious problems. I think most people have known about and recognize that energy is a problem. And I think energy, again, giving an Indian perspective to it, I mean, for us, energy is a problem for the very simple reason that we want to increase, we're a low-income country, and it is not at all acceptable to us as a nation to accept this low level of per capita income. It's been going up, but at a time when the conventional definition of, say, somebody crossing over into industrialized income levels is, say, $15,000, and if India's income is somewhere around $4,000 on a purchasing power parity basis, we have a lot of catching up to do. And if we're going to do that, it's going to need energy. There is also what you would call the energy requirement of meeting basic energy needs. A large part of our population doesn't actually have enough access to electricity. But that is actually a very small part of what we need. The biggest part of the energy we need is the energy we need in order to get to higher levels of per capita income. If you define the problem purely as the energy needed to meet basic needs, that's not a problem. That's also just a distributional problem. So the real issue is, how do we get that energy? Now, it's a problem because in two ways. First of all, we don't have enough domestic energy. I mean, availability of primary energy sources in India is limited, and we are, at the moment, import dependent. It depends on how you calculate it, but if you do a sort of million tons of oil equivalent concept, our current import dependence, taking all forms of energy, is about 37%. Now, that's a pretty high level of import dependence, and import dependence has two implications. I mean, first of all, if you have to import the stuff, then what happens to the world price of that stuff matters, because in effect it erodes real income. If the world price of energy were to fall, that's the equivalent of a windfall gain in terms of income. And if the world price of energy were to rise, that's an equivalent of a windfall loss in income. So really, from our point of view, whatever we can do to reduce import dependence by saving on energy demand, by more energy efficiency, or by increasing domestic supply, leads to an improvement in terms of energy security because we're less dependent on imports. That's a very reasonable sort of approach. From a sustainability point of view, there's also the issue of what kind of energy are we using to meet our demands. And I think here, stepping into a little back and looking at considerations of climate change, etc., this conference is not about climate change, but somewhere it's a sustainable development summit. So the issue of global sustainability, the issue of global carbon budgets, the issue of how do you fit your carbon requirements into a sustainable carbon requirement for the rest of the world has to be somewhere in the background. And here you have a problem. And the problem really is that there are ways of increasing energy security that would be consistent with sustainability. I mean, for example, if we were to go nuclear, if we were to go solar, if we were to go wind energy, hydro, etc. And there are ways of reducing energy dependence by expanding the domestic production of coal, which would not be consistent with sustainability in the sense that it would imply a larger carbon footprint for the Indian development path. Now, Indian economy being, it's not really a large economy, but we have hopes that it's going to become even larger. And certainly in terms of total absorption of energy, we are among the major fellows. An energy strategy for India that depends on a more intensive exploitation of domestic coal resources, or indeed use of coal resources. But at the moment, we are not only producing a fair amount of coal, but we're beginning to import more coal. Well, we should certainly reduce the import and produce more of our own, and there is scope for that. But in the overall energy security calculation, If you build in the concern of sustainability from the point of view of containing carbon emissions, then efforts to improve energy security based on expanded carbon production runs into this other constraint over time. How do we act? But fortunately, I mean, we have a lot of scope for expanding other sources of energy. And obviously, the most important ones are the ones I've mentioned. I mean, hydro, nuclear, wind, and solar. At the moment, wind and solar are actually very small. Nuclear is also pretty small. Over time, it's possible to envisage a much more dramatic increase in all of these sources of energy. Now, I should say that, you know, the sort of sustainability stakeholders raise multiple problems with each of these. Possibly wind is the only one that I've not heard too many problems raised, but for nuclear, there are the obvious concerns about safety, etc., which have been highlighted a little more because of the unfortunate incident in Fukushima. In the case of solar, there is simply the land requirement. I mean, we are blessed in this country with a lot of solar energy, or rather with a lot of insulation, but tapping that insulation to convert it into energy does require a lot of land, and that brings in a sort of a constraint over there. And of course, we have untapped hydro potential, but utilizing that brings us into direct conflict with many sustainability-related stakeholders who have very strong objections to almost any effort to tap hydropower. So it's a very difficult sort of situation in the sense that until very recently, the conventional wisdom on tapping hydropower was that large dams are not a good idea, and one should go for run-of-the-river projects. Since then, the debate has actually changed, and run-of-the-river projects are also being subjected to quite a lot of criticism. A lot of this criticism, by the way, is not unreasonable. And I think what's happening is that as you switch to something, the need to bring in a scientific basis for exploiting that resource scientifically surfaces. And many of those concerns actually are valid, but it's very important for us to have a clear scientific appreciation of what these concerns are, respond to the ones that are scientifically valid, and simply not respond to the others. This is actually not always very difficult, very easy, but I think it's something that we do need to handle. I mean, I've just come back from the Northeast, for example, where the estimated unutilized hydro potential is something of the order of 50,000 megawatts. But exploiting that 50,000 megawatts will require inundation of land and some submergence of forested area. So there are trade-offs involved. Those who object very strongly to the development of that hydropower do not make clear whether what they're saying is that India should just not have more energy, or whether they're saying it's much better to burn coal and not exploit hydropower. So that issue is, there are lots of difficult issues that arise in that context. Now, you know, we, on the energy side, we're looking at what is possible in the longer term. And in the Planning Commission, and in this we've been assisted by DFID, the British aid agency, put us in touch with the energy people in the UK who have developed a sort of an energy pathways calculator, which more or less allows you to spell out alternative scenarios. And this is not a projection model. There's very little in the model that's actually endogenous. But it does allow you to spell out the implications of different assumptions that can be made about what's going to happen in this sector and how much can you improve and all the rest of it. I forget all the details. We are about to publish all of this and put it on the web. But roughly, as I recall, we have about 6 or 7 major sectors, which are the sectors that absorb energy: transport, industry, etc. Within each of these sectors, we are trying to quantify what are the possible scenarios which could work. I mean, for example, in transport, I mean, what's going to be the likely, how does passenger transport move and how does freight transport move, given what we hope is going to happen to GDP. And roughly we're talking about a GDP growth rate which, once we get over the current slowdown, will begin somewhere around 8%, and by about 2050 will decelerate to about 6%. That's quite a reasonable, I mean, when I say reasonable, that's an optimistic, reasonable assumption, because that would generate all the GDP growth that one wants to see per capita income rise. And then one works out what does it mean for these individual sectors, and how do you handle the choices within each of these sectors, and that generates energy demand. And you can feed and you can respond to that energy demand by making different assumptions about what's going to happen to energy supply, and we distinguish about 10 different supply sectors, including things like, you know, biofuels, things that are really beyond our current horizon. But if you're looking for 2050, then I think one should be expecting that there's going to be a lot of change in the world. And we're trying to explore what is possible. Now, these are not Planning Commission projections, and our objective is to involve people in the debate by putting this calculator on our website with all the assumptions laid out relating to each parameter. And it will allow individuals who have a different view to make different assumptions. But the point is that having made that different assumption, you'll get a consistent picture of the whole. And we hope that that would actually create a more vigorous debate on the choices that the country faces. But to give you just some idea, I mean, on a sort of a least effort, what I would call a sort of disappointing scenario basis, disappointing in relation to energy choices, what happens is that if you make those disappointing assumptions about energy efficiency, savings in energy, also growth of energy production and what have you, and you somehow think that the economy is going to grow at that rate, your import dependence goes up from 37% to 81%. I mean, it's totally unacceptable for a scale of economy of that size. On the other hand, I mean, if you can actually do a lot of what we call making heroic assumptions, then the same growth rate is possible with an import dependence, which is only 21%. In other words, import dependence could actually go down compared to the 37% it is today, providing we do a whole lot of things. And I think what we want to do is to create a debate so that people ask the question, do we want to achieve this? Now, clearly, if you take the view that, look, energy independence is not necessary. I mean, for example, in my view, it's not necessary to have energy import independence for some ordinary commodity. It doesn't matter if you're importing 100% of it in a global world. But the question is energy like that? And my answer is it's not. So I think as people move to consider what they regard as a reasonable level of energy dependence, they will themselves be forced to recognize that either the growth rate won't take place, or if that growth rate is to happen, then it can only happen if it's supported by very dramatic efforts to increase the efficiency of energy use and equally dramatic efforts to increase domestic supply, preferably of green energy. Now, underlying all this is where the economist comes in. There is no way, I repeat, no way, that a reasonable outcome is going to be possible without energy pricing reflecting the scarcity of energy. And this is absolutely critical, because I find whenever I address gatherings and so on, you can actually in India go through a whole hour of discussions on energy security without energy pricing being mentioned once. Now, this is just absurd. And I think this is the most important message that think tanks, the press, anybody must put across. We need to recognize nobody is going to be interested in saving energy if energy is not expensive. And nobody is going to be interested in producing energy if you're not willing to pay for it. And these two rather elementary points, in my view, are not adequately stressed by the think tanks that worry about energy, and even less by the think tanks that worry about sustainability. Now, how to do that, I hope that when we put this out in a few days' time, it will get people thinking. And I think there's a lot, actually, that can be done in this area. I'm not saying, by the way, that the only way of bringing about energy efficiency is sort of a fix the prices and everything would be right. Not at all. I think you need to combine a sensible price policy for energy with a sensible, far-sighted regulatory approach which forces energy efficiency. We know what happens in the rest of the world. I mean, in the United States in the 1970s, after the first oil crisis, the US government introduced quite arbitrarily requirements to improve the energy efficiency of refrigeration. Huge outcry from the industry. People saying this is anti-American, it will undermine this, that, and the other. But the fact is, when they did that, a short while later, the industry was actually able to meet those requirements. Now, the great advantage for us is that, you know, if India is to achieve energy efficiency, frankly, it only makes sense for us to achieve it if the rest of the world is also achieving it. And the truth is that the technology needed to be energy efficient is likely to be generated anyway by the whole world if they're doing the same thing. So frankly, the benefit of regulatory interventions in India can be very high simply because we know that these more efficient technologies are going to be developed because of the resources that the rest of the world is going to be able to put on them. But it does mean additional cost, and this is the important point. You know, it's very easy to postulate that there is going to be such a revolution in technology that we're going to be able to get everything we want at half the price. And I know that in the world of electronics, I mean, this is frequently said, you know, I don't know whether it's every year or every 6 months, but they say twice the computing power at half the cost, and this keeps happening. Now, it certainly happened in the solar photovoltaic area, where costs have been falling quite a bit, and are likely, even in India, within a couple of years, are likely to reach grid parity for the marginal additional sources of demand. But, you know, the average cost of electricity is not based on what the marginal cost is. It's based on the entire historic cost of the average cost of the accumulated stock. So if you're adding to it at high marginal costs, the consequence of that must be that electricity prices have to go up. And this is very, very difficult to do, and I think, I mean, I meet with political leaders, both at the national level and at the state level. And I would say that, you know, the big progress that has been made is that people now know that this is true. I mean, there was a time when people questioned whether it was true. That's not the case. But I think what people say, well, that may be theoretically true, but it's practically very difficult. You know, the good news is that we don't have to do it immediately. I mean, in our long-term scenarios are calibrated around the year 2047. That's 3 years short of the 2050, which is normally used in climate change discussions. But it happens to be India's 100th year of independence. So we thought it would be better to have a terminal year that resonates with people, that 100 years after becoming independent, what is our energy scenario going to look like? And by the way, whatever it looks like is going to be pretty much the best that we can do then is pretty much predetermining what we're going to do in 2050. And the bottom line message is there's a huge scope for variation. Linked to that variation in outcomes is a lot of effort. But I have to point out that, even on the best assumptions, India's per capita emissions in 2050 will exceed 2 tons per capita, which is currently described as the global budget average that should be there. Now, of course, every country doesn't have to be at the average, and there's an issue of how you distribute the burden of what is a sustainable budget. So there's no reason why the currently poorer countries can't have a better outcome. Those are things that hopefully will get decided sometime in the UNFCCC. I guess 2050 is long enough, even for a UN process, to reach some kind of conclusion, although the way it's going at the moment, it would be difficult to believe that any result is going to come out of that. But anyway, I think what I'm trying to say is that we're grappling with the scale of the problem. Turning a little bit to water, in many ways, water is actually even more difficult to handle than energy. I mean, for the simple reason that the Earth has pretty much the same amount of freshwater supply that it did 10,000 years ago. That's not true of energy, because the total supply of energy is actually expanding. And with technology, clean energy may well be expanding, and the sun is an inexhaustible source, but as far as water is concerned, it's not. And we are water scarce. I forget the numbers, but we have 16% of the world's population, 4% of the world's supply of fresh water. And water is not something that we can import, unlike energy. So how to manage a high level of GDP with a highly scarce domestic resource and no scope, or not much scope, for relying on imports is a huge challenge. And I think it's something that we need to worry about a lot. And unlike sustainability in the context of carbon emissions, where there's an element of externality, and this is well known that whenever you have an externality, a market equilibrium will not be optimal, because there will be too much of the activities that generate negative externality and not enough of the activities that generate positive externality. And the job of governments is how to encourage the positive externality and how to discourage the negative externality. Now, when you put that on the international scale, that's what the UNFCCC should be doing. But as far as water is concerned, there are no global externalities there. There are huge externalities. They're all internal to the country. But handling externalities even within a country is actually extremely difficult. We know, for example, that in the allocation of water between riparian states, upper and lower riparian states, it's extremely difficult to reach an agreement. And there are lots of discussions which say things like the need for water for agriculture should have absolute priority and industry should come second. Actually, no. What usually goes is drinking water should have the highest priority. That's the easiest thing, because the amount of drinking water that people need is well within the capacity of the total system to deliver. But the usual hierarchy that people talk about is drinking water first, agriculture second, industry third. The real problem in India is that 80% of our water is used for agriculture, and it's used at efficiency levels that are absurd. So actually, water efficiency in agriculture with known technologies can be increased 100%, which actually means that from the point of view of total water availability, we have an extra 40% of what we are using, which can be made available for the rest of the system, providing we could get to optimal, most efficient use of water in agriculture. That is extremely difficult to do, because one reason is that water is not priced to reflect its scarcity. And I mean, from an economist's point of view, If you can't price water for political reasons, then you must ration it. And it's not clear that we can actually ration it, because it's not clear from a legal point of view, nor is it clear that you can, in practical terms, introduce that kind of rationing. So, huge problem. But I think in water, one of the most important things really is that we can harness a lot more of our water resources than we do. And groundwater recharge through multiple programs of watershed management are probably the highest bang for the buck in terms of developing a strategy for dealing with water shortage. So we have produced a new water policy. We're trying to increase consciousness at the state level of the importance of having a rational water policy. Water is essentially a state subject. I mean, it's not generally realized, but the Constitution makes only one provision for the central government to have a say in the management of water resources. And that is that in the management of intrastate rivers, the central government can step in provided Parliament passes a law for this purpose. We have never attempted to pass a law that would empower the center to take charge of interstate rivers. So rational allocation really depends on states agreeing with each other. This was relatively easy when water was not all that scarce. It's become hugely difficult now that water is scarce. So we have problems there that we need to handle. But groundwater recharge, in order to retain as much as possible of the water that actually falls, this is something that can be done, and in the Planning Commission, we're putting a lot of emphasis on it. So really, on sustainability and the subjects here, from an Indian perspective, my view is, don't worry too much about food security. It can be taken care of. Please worry about energy, and please get really frantic about water. One of the biggest differences between water and energy is that actually water is scarcer than energy, but there is a willingness on the part of the public to pay a price for energy, with here and there a debate or two, but by and large pay a price. There isn't a willingness to pay a sensible price for water. So essentially, if we can't change that mindset, it's going to be very difficult to reach to solutions which are technically feasible, but won't become a reality unless there's a lot more pressure and recognition of what needs to be done. I've probably taken more time, Patchy, than you intended me to, so I'm quite happy to stop at this point.